All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for coming on what may very well be the last beautiful Friday that we have. My name is Stefano Eurowhiteness. For the few among you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Remarque Institute, and together with Sam Paul and Amy and Lauren Bessie, we're going to be your hosts for today, including for those of you who are on the Zoom. So together with us, as you already know, we have Hans Kundnani, who is an associate fellow and former Europe program director at Chatham House, and who will be a Remarque Institute fellow in the spring semester. He is the author of Utopia Auschwitz, Germany's 68th generation in the Holocaust, which I feel like throwing out because I did read it immediately when it came out and I taught it. And I have never had an occasion to just say, like, put you together with it in the same form, and it feels important in its own form. At any rate, it is a remarkable and vibrant history of Germany's movement from the radical 60s to Holocaust memorialization in the 2000s as the sort of social and intellectual problems and tensions to be thinking with. He is also the author of The Paradox of German Power, where the title really speaks for itself, except that we're speaking of paradoxes of domestic versus international, European versus global, tensions of the German past versus hopes of German power into the future. He has written for The Observer, The Guardian, The New Statesman, and many other journals. And he's here to speak to us today about Eurowhiteness, culture, empire, and race in the European project, which is in many respects the first major and broadly readable account of the difficult problems felt widely and examined for quite a long time now, sometimes by scholars, but not put together into a critique of the European Union, into a systematic critique of the European Union. As opposed to the conventional approach to the EU as a cosmopolitan project, Hans presents an argument that this is a regional or regionalist project, a kind of translation of nationalism to supranational spaces, with all sorts of problems as to the relationship to the rest of the world and to the relationship to Europe itself. Within this framework, as he shows and argues, we have a tension between a civic regionalism, so regionalism at the and civic ideals on the one hand, and the civilizing mission, which at times turns deeply racial, which is, and then turns more aggressively racial as well. So the account that we see is that one of tensions, especially in the early years of the European Union, and then a move toward the civic nationalism or civic regionalism in the 60s to about 2010, that then returns to the much more cultural and in some ways racial project, the Eurowhiteness project of a civilizing mission from the 2010 debt crisis and the immigrant crisis, the refugee crisis of the 2000 teens to the present. That's a very quick sense, because I don't want to, I don't want to say too little and I don't want to say too much at the same time. Together with Hans, we have Miriam Ticktin, who is going to speak second, and who's professor of anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center, and the author of Casualties of Care, Immigration and the Politics of Humanitarianism in France. And her next book is titled, according to the website at least, Beyond Innocence, and deals with precisely these problems around the idealization of innocence, from what I understand so far. And last but not least, we have my new colleague at NYU, Audrey Celestine. Welcome, Audrey. I sort of feel ridiculous that I haven't had another chance to welcome you into Remarque as well. Audrey is Associate Professor of History and French Studies at NYU and the author of 3 books, De Vie de Combat, Femmes Noires et Libres, from 2020, La Fabrique des Identités from 2018, which concerns the political framing of Caribbean minorities in New York and in Paris, and Une famille française des Antilles à Dunkerque en passant par l'Algérie. Sorry, too many L's and R's for this Greek. So with no further ado, I think that we'll have Hans talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll continue with comments and questions and internal discussion for a total of the first 45 or so, and then we'll open it up to discussion with the audience. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Stefanos, for that very flattering and kind introduction. It's so nice to be here. I've spent the last 10 days doing various talks at American universities, but it's particularly nice to be at the Remarque Institute, I guess for two reasons. One is that, as Stefanos mentioned, I'm going to be a visiting scholar here from January. So it's really nice to be here for that reason, but also because I slightly feel as if the figure of Tony Judd kind of hangs over a little bit, you know, partly because he's a Brit, a Londoner, in fact, like I am, you know, writing about Europe. And one of the nicest things, actually, that in some of the reviews that the book that have come out, in one of the reviews, somebody compared the book to Tony Judd's essay, A Grand Illusion, and it wasn't consciously in my mind as I was writing it, but I do feel as if somehow he was hanging over the book. And frankly, I think also some of my Euroscepticism probably comes a little bit from Tony Judd. So he's sort of somehow present, which makes it another reason why it's really nice to be here. Stefanos, you've already, in a way, done a brilliant summary of my book. You know, better than I could. You know, I think, like many book authors, you know, we sort of struggle to summarize our book in a short way. But I guess what I'll do just for 10 minutes or so is to give a slightly longer summary of the book. But it will be, you know, I'll whiz through it because it covers, I mean, it's a short book, but it covers quite a lot of ground. And it's sort of deliberately written in that way. And so what I'll do is I'll just kind of, I'll sort of whiz through the argument a little bit, and then we can, I mean, I'm really looking forward to the responses, and then we can get into more depth about any of the aspects that I touch on in my little summary. So I think probably the simplest way of thinking about what the book is or what it does is that it's about the history of ideas of Europe, going all the way back to the medieval period. And then it tries to think about how we should understand the European Union, the post-1945 integration project, in the context of that longer history of ideas of Europe. And in particular, and Stefanos has already hinted at this, the key sort of distinction that I make in the book is essentially between ethnic cultural ideas of Europe on the one hand and civic ideas of Europe on the other hand. And in making that distinction, I'm really borrowing this distinction from the study of nationalism, in particular from Hans Korn, who wrote this book, The Idea of Nationalism, in 1944, where he distinguishes between ethnic nationalism on the one hand and civic nationalism on the other hand. And my argument is essentially that we can think about Europe and the European Union in a somewhat analogous way. The way that a lot of pro-Europeans, in other words, supporters of European integration in its current form, like to think about the EU is that it's an expression of cosmopolitanism and that it's sort of the opposite of nationalism. I want to suggest that that's not a very helpful way of thinking about it as the opposite of nationalism. In fact, it's somewhat analogous to nationalism, except on a larger continental scale. So I propose this concept of regionalism, as I say, as a sort of analog to nationalism, except on this larger continental scale. And part of the reason I think it's really helpful, this idea of regionalism, is because it allows us to then take all of these intellectual resources that we have from the study of nationalism, and not necessarily to automatically apply them to regionalism, but to think about whether they might also apply to regionalism. So let's take, for example, you know, Benedict Anderson's famous idea of nations as imagined communities. It seems to me that we can think of Europe also as being an imagined community. It's perhaps a slightly different kind of imagined community, but an imagined community nevertheless. And in particular, as I say, I think one of the most helpful concepts from the study of nationalism is this distinction between ethnic, cultural on the one hand and civic on the other hand, which, as I say, I'm basically applying from nationalism and saying that in the same way as in the history of different nationalisms, there's this kind of complex interaction between ethnic, cultural elements and civic elements. The same thing goes for the history of European regionalism. And really, my book tries to kind of tell the story of how those ethnic cultural elements and the civic elements have interacted through this long history. So the story begins really in the medieval period. I mean, I talk a little bit about classical antiquity, where obviously the name Europe comes from, and the idea of Europe as a space. but it's really only in the medieval period that you get the first idea of European identity. In other words, Europeans as people. The first reference that we seem to have to Europeans as people is in something called the Mozarabic Chronicle, which is this 8th century account of the conflict between, in particular, the Franks, in other words, the forerunners of today's French, and Muslim forces. And it's interesting that in that first reference to Europeans, where it's the Franks that are described as Europeans, they're explicitly contrasted with Arabs. So that othering of Islam is there from the beginning in the idea of Europe, it seems to me. And in that period, in medieval period, it is fairly straightforwardly, what it means to be European is fairly straightforwardly synonymous with Christianity. Europe is synonymous with Christendom, and being European is roughly synonymous with being Christian. And so in that context, the kind of main internal other for Europe are Jews, and the main external other for Europe are Muslims. And it's really sort of relatively straightforward in that sense. The emblematic figure of that medieval idea of Europeanness that's synonymous with Christianity is the figure of Charlemagne, who then later on becomes this figurehead, this kind of inspirational figure for the European Union itself. I'll come back to that a bit later on. But that, I think, already sort of illustrates how, this idea of Europe as Christian never really goes away. It kind of remains and continues even to the present day. Nevertheless, you do get, with the beginning of the modern period, a new, much more complex idea of Europe. And on the one hand, this is, emerges in the context of the European Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution. So it's a much more secular, rationalist idea of Europe, as opposed to a religious one in the medieval period. But it also emerges in the context of the encounter of Europeans with the populations of Africa and Asia, and in particular the Americas, in the context of, what is known as the Age of Discovery or the Age of Exploration. So in other words, it's the same context out of which the idea of whiteness emerges. And so this new modern idea of Europe is not just a secular rationalist one, as opposed to a religious one. It's also a racialized one, closely connected to the concept of whiteness. And I think you can see that, again, that connection between Europe and whiteness continues to this day. I mean, if you think about the way that the term white is used in the United States, it roughly means people of European origin, right? That's still roughly the common sense way in which that term is used. So the question then becomes, and this is really the question that the book tries to answer, is, well, what happens then after 1945? Pro-Europeans tend to want to think that you have this completely new idea of Europe that emerges in 1945, that 1945 is a kind of hour zero, and that these older ethnic cultural ideas of Europe connected to Christianity and whiteness sort of just magically disappear in 1945, and that what emerges is this new idea of European identity centered on what becomes the European Union, but is purely civic. I think it's fairly clear, if you look at the history, that it's much messier than that. I mean, I've already hinted at the continuity of the idea of a Christian Europe with the figure of Charlemagne. And in 1950, the Charlemagne Prize is awarded for the first time. It remains to this day the most prestigious prize for pro-Europeans. And as I say, it's awarded in the name of this embodiment of this medieval idea of Europeanness, which is synonymous with Christianity. And if what you want to say after 1945 is we've made this massive break with our past and we have a completely new idea of Europe, is a rather strange kind of choice of inspiration to pick. But I think that, as I say, illustrates that the history is messier. And so then, I try to tell the story of the European project roughly in sort of 3 phases. And Stefanos has already kind of indicated sort of how that has evolved, how that sort of evolved a little bit. It begins with this, I guess, the phase from 1945 to roughly the end of the Cold War. That's what I think of as being the first sort of phase of this project. And I think it's important to emphasize that in the early phase of European integration in the 1950s, it's very clear now, this was written out of the story of the European project for a long time, but we now have a decade, at least a decade of decades worth of scholarship on this that shows that at the beginning, European integration was a colonial project. And not just that, it intersected with the end of European colonialism. So in that sense, you can't think of European integration as a post-colonial, project just in chronological terms. They intersect chronologically. But more than that, it's the fact that, as I say, it's very clear from the work that we have on this now, in particular, a book called Eurafrica by Pio Hansen and Stefan Jonsson, which came out in 2014. So in other words, nearly a decade ago, they show very clearly that part of the point of European integration in the 1950s was for Belgium and France to consolidate, to integrate, if you like, their remaining colonies in West and Central Africa. They still had huge colonial possessions in West and Central Africa at that time, which they had no intention of giving up. But as I say, they were no longer able to maintain them on their own. In particular, what they needed was an injection of West German capital. And this was part of the thinking of European integration. This is part of the point of European integration in its early phases. So in the book, I call this the original sin of European integration, consciously analogizing to the role of slavery in the founding of the United States. However, pretty soon after the Treaty of Rome is signed in 1957, which includes all of these colonial possessions, those French and Belgian colonies in West and Central Africa become independent, roughly around 1960. And so that's the end of the EU as a kind of, or the forerunner of the EU, the EEC, as a formal kind of colonial project. I think there's still big questions about whether it has neo-colonial elements, particularly in, for example, EU Africa policy, but that's another story. And so then what I think happens after that is, so roughly from about 1960 onwards, is you do start to get, the EU turns inwards a little bit. And out of that context comes, I think, this new civic idea of Europe, a new civic regionalism, which is centered in particular on the idea of the social market economy and the welfare state. In other words, a kind of a socioeconomic model. And then also a political model, which is the depoliticized mode of governance that European integration had produced, sort of this kind of technocratic kind of approach to international politics. That becomes increasingly what pro-Europeans think that Europe stands for. So as I say, it's problematic in all kinds of ways, but it is, I think, the closest that the EU has ever come to a purely civic regionalism. One of the problems, though, with it is that after the loss of those Belgian and French colonies, the history of European colonialism and the role of the early phase of European integration in it gets completely forgotten. It gets consigned to a memory hole, in fact, to quote Tony Judd. At exactly the moment, in other words, from the sort of 60s onwards, when the Holocaust is starting to become incorporated into the official story of of European integration, and starts to become this central collective memory for what becomes the EU. It's not there at the time of the Schuman Plan in 1950. Nobody's talking about the Holocaust at that point, but from the 1960s, particularly as the sort of West German memory culture gets kind of uploaded to the European level, this starts to become a really central collective memory. And so really by the end of the Cold War, the EU has started to become this community of memory, which focuses in particular on, this long history of internal conflict within Europe, culminating in World War II and the Holocaust. And the Holocaust is kind of incorporated into that story. It's easy to see that can be done in quite a neat kind of way, not least because the Holocaust takes place in the context of World War II. And so the way I think of this is that the EU increasingly thinks of itself as being based on the internal lessons of European history. In other words, what Europeans did to each other, but not on the external lessons of European history. In other words, what Europeans did to the rest of the world, in particular colonialism. And so it sort of encourages, I think, Europeans to think about their history as a kind of a closed system, a kind of self-contained history that had nothing to do with other parts of the world, in particular Africa and the Middle East, with which it has a lot of connections. So that's really the period up to the end of the Cold War. And then what I think happens after the end of the Cold War, in the sort of 2 decades from about 1990 to 2010, is the EU goes into this quite expansive, optimistic kind of mode. This is in the context of, the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and then enlargement to include Central and Eastern European countries. And in that context, pro-Europeans almost start to imagine that they can remake the whole world in the image of the European Union. It's a slightly hubristic kind of moment. So, for example, my former boss at a think tank that I used to work at, the European Council on Foreign Relations, Mark Leonard, wrote a book at that time in the 2000s, which really captures this kind of moment, and it's called "Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century." Right. Now, there are at least kind of two problems with this. One is that I think what this leads to is a kind of revival of the idea of a European civilizing mission. This is one of, I think, the long continuities in the history of these ideas of Europe, is this idea of a civilizing mission. In the medieval period, that you have a religious mission. Then in the modern period with Enlightenment, this starts to become what we can now recognize as the sort of modern European civilizing mission, based on universal values which Europeans have discovered, but think of having universal applicability, and that takes you very quickly, I think, to this idea. Then those ideas have to be spread around the world. And Jan Zielonka, who was a Polish academic who was at Oxford for a long time, wrote, I think, very persuasively about how you can think of the accession process to include Central and Eastern European countries as a kind of a new postmodern kind of European civilizing mission. That Central and Eastern European countries had to be civilized before they could become EU member states. You also have in that period, in the 1990s and the 2000s, all these kind of theories emerging about the EU as an actor in international politics. So in particular, this idea of the EU as a normative power, which again is this idea that the EU is civilizing international politics itself. The second problem, though, is that as the EU's borders to the east become softer and Central and Eastern European countries join what becomes the EU, the EU's borders remain very hard. In particular, Morocco applies to join the EC in 1987 and is just told kind of flatly that you can't because you're not a European state. So I think there's a way in which this contrast between the East and the South actually strengthens the idea that the European Union is a white bloc, basically. And that brings me, and I'll be very quick on this, brings me to the sort of final chapter, in a way, of the story that I tell, which is roughly from 2010 to the present day. I think that expansive, optimistic moment for the EU comes to a rather abrupt end with the Euro crisis, and then the whole series of crises that the EU faces after 2010. And it goes into a much more sort of defensive kind of mode. It starts to see itself as being surrounded by threats. And then I think the real critical juncture, which Stefanos has again already mentioned, is the refugee crisis in 2015. And that produces what I call the civilizational turn in the European project. And what I really mean by that is the idea that these threats to the EU become increasingly perceived in civilizational terms. And you see this very, very clearly, above all, in migration policy, refugee policy. Also, though, I think in European foreign policy debates, which increasingly are framed in terms of a kind of clash of civilizations. But unlike Sam Huntington's version of that, it's not the West as one civilization, it's Europe as a distinct civilization, distinct also from the United States, by the way. This is how, for example, Macron talks. And what sort of, this is against the background of the rise of the far right everywhere in Europe. And I think you start to get this kind of convergence between the centre-right and the far-right, where the centre-right is increasingly mimicking and adopting far-right rhetoric and policies, particularly on these questions around identity and immigration and Islam. And so, my conclusion, in a way, this was the sort of political urgency of this book, was to say that my impression is that these ethnic cultural elements of European identity, far from getting weaker, actually now seem to be getting stronger. And it's those ethnic cultural elements of European identity connected to Christianity and to whiteness that I call Eurowhiteness. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. That was fabulous. Yeah, and thank you so much, Steph, for inviting me to read this book and comment on it. It was really a pleasure to read. It's a really excellent, I think, compelling book. It covers incredibly difficult issues and in very clear prose. So it tells the history of Europe, but also includes a lot of theory in ways that are very accessible, I think. So I found it masterful and really, really a pleasure to read. So you've already heard the key arguments, that Europe is a form of regionalism akin to nationalism, one that's built on both civic and ethno-cultural forms, but ultimately has an exclusionary whiteness and Christianity embedded at its core. And then while Europe is seen as a peace project, it was actually constructed as a way to continue or replace forms of empire. So in other words, Europe is a colonial project, not an anti-colonial one or even a post-colonial one. So there's a lot more to say. But I'm going to, I guess, pick up on three aspects that I found fascinating and really just try to think with them. And then at the very end, I'll ask a couple questions. So first, I want to start with the issue of Europe getting forged in the cauldron of colonialism and what this means for the way we understand borders in particular. So we might think of Europe as naturally geographically ending at the Mediterranean and borders as inevitably being geographically or territorially tethered. But Hun shows that the Mediterranean border was only created in 1976, actually. So previously, the project of European integration, as he just mentioned, included Algeria and other French and Belgian colonies in order to extract resources. As he writes, Africa was seen as the dowry in the new European relationship between France and Germany in the 1950s, and others pushed for the colonies to be included in order to extract resources such as iron ore. So this made the geographic majority of Europe in Africa, actually. So again, these don't map clearly to the way we might imagine Europe to be. In the 1990s, Europe started pushing its borders back down into Africa, offering aid and other forms of development in exchange for them to police migrants and detain them in camps. So a central goal, as many of you know, of Frontex, which is the European or the EU border agency, is to achieve total surveillance of Europe's increasingly thick borderlands. And these include not only the Mediterranean and the border areas of North Africa, but literally, this is what it says, anywhere from which migration could originate. So this justifies an ever-widening terrain of policing and surveillance. So by pressuring African states from Niger to Sudan to participate in the EU migrant policing apparatus and inducing them to do so via trade deals or arms transfers or in aid programs, the EU has effectively pushed its borders into sub-Saharan Africa. But what you tell us is this is not new. In fact, it was only a tiny moment where Europe actually was this little thing contained at the borders of the Mediterranean. The geographic borders. It's always been a project of Eurafrique or Eurafrica, which today is being, reframed as a goal or project of peace. And I'm thinking of France-Afrique, one of mutuality and good relations, rather than one grounded on the history of colonial extraction. So I think there are two things to take away from this. First, that borders are never solid or steady, as we know, or clearly grounded in material geographies. There's nothing natural about them. And if we want a better world, we have to be explicit about this and work to reimagine borders ourselves. And I think this helps in that. They're political and economic constructions, and most of all, they're based on political imagination. The second thing is that Europe will never exist without Africa. There is no such thing. So the question is what we do. Knowledge. It could be, as the way you end, a place for the beginnings of a project of reparations or repair. Yeah. It's clear that that project repair and reparations cannot begin without that knowledge, obviously. Yeah. The second thing I wanted to think with was the idea about the Holocaust as the mechanism by which colonialism has been forgotten in Europe. And I think this is fascinating. The argument is that the Holocaust was seen as a radical rupture in the Enlightenment thinking and the civilizational project, and that the focus on the Holocaust as an exception allowed colonialism to be rendered invisible. Racism, which was identified with Nazism, was soundly rejected, so it could no longer exist in the histories of colonialism. In some sense, it allowed it to be put aside and placed internally. So the new peaceful Europe rose from its ashes. Again, EU was the mechanism for colonial forgetting, and I think that's a really wonderful insight. So I actually just wanted to kind of push it a little
Yep.
further and to say that the EU has enabled something even stronger, and that's a claim to racial innocence. And this gets to the stuff that Stephanos mentioned. So, there are a number of concepts that have been used for this kind of amnesia. There's colonial unknowing and colonial aphasia and white ignorance and a whole lot of other ones. And while these explain how knowledge can be filtered, rendering certain histories unintelligible, innocence does a different kind of work. It goes beyond simply not knowing, although that is part of the etymology. The thing about it is it's the will to not know. That's part of the definition of innocence, right? So it's about a refusal of accountability. Innocence is about a lack of responsibility. That is, it makes the problem a moral one and then enables the refusal of blame. So Charles Mills, for instance, who was a wonderful political theorist, suggests that white ignorance also includes moral ignorance, meaning not only the ignorance of facts, but moral unknowings, incorrect judgments about the rights and wrongs of moral situations themselves. So I'm interested in how people not only make incorrect moral judgments, but absolve themselves of the responsibility for racism and other forms of violence and exploitation. So it's not just not knowing, it's refusing to take responsibility for it. So when innocence is claimed, the refusal to know becomes a refusal to repent. It manifests in a demand to be judged innocent. Shock and moral outrage both reveal and prove the innocence of those who were duped or seen as ignorant. So I think, this concept, I would just say, take it even further, it helps to explain a number of things that you've been talking about European politics, and certainly the French politics in relation to its non-white populations, often, of colonial origin. There's no responsibility taken for the situation of dispossession, for the ongoing racism, and there is really a claim to innocence there. And yet, France continues to invest in it and extract strategic raw materials from its former colonies, and it maintains a financial stranglehold over large swaths of the African continent. Today, 14 African nations continue to use a colonial-era French currency that obliges them to deposit at least 50% of their foreign reserves in a French bank. So, and we've seen what's happening with Niger and so on. It's, get out. France's long enduring sans-papier movement, by and for undocumented immigrants, including its recent incarnations as the Gilets Noirs and La Chapelle Debout collective, have long argued that they're in France claiming asylum precisely because of France's actions in their home countries. They point to these financial arrangements and to the fact that it is a regime of extraction. This produces, obviously, many of the conflicts that they have to flee in and end up in France for. So I'm also wondering, according to this argument, if we can see today why Europe finds it easier to recognize Israel as the fallout of the Holocaust, but finds it more difficult to think about Palestine through the lens of colonialism. As Hans states, recognizing histories of colonialism undermines the project of the EU. There's a lot more to say about this. And as we know, of course, the language of innocence is what frames an enormous amount of the discourse around Israel and Palestine. So there's a lot to say there about kind of racial innocence, I think. Okay, last point, and then some questions. So I loved the last chapter. I really loved it, about Brexit. And I learned a lot, and it changed my way of thinking about it. From something really negative to something with unexpected possibilities. And as I was saying briefly to Hans earlier, I come at it from a very particular perspective, is so part of what Hans proposes is a different model based on the Commonwealth, right? So not regionalism, but actually taking up the Commonwealth as a set of different kinds of relationships. So, my mother's from India, my father's from South Africa. I was born in Canada. They met because of the Commonwealth. Right. They were able to get to Canada as members of the Commonwealth, and they met in Montreal. And so, there's a really interesting deep set of connections created by this idea, and to burrow down into them is really intriguing, I think. I agree that it offers a way to think about how to take stock of colonial histories and inequalities, addressing new forms of responsibility, and it can help us to understand the ways in which we are all implicated. I like the language of implicatedness, and this is Rothberg's idea, going beyond victim and perpetrator, innocent and guilty, but kind of degrees and levels and positions of implicatedness. There's a lot of other words around this. Can be complicity, but it can be where somebody's a beneficiary, and so you're a perpetuator instead of a perpetrator. So there's a lot of different languages of moral accountability here. So I think this opens up a lot of those. It offers a form of imagination beyond sovereignty, which I really appreciate, beyond regionalism and nationalism, and what you call a post-imperial network of countries. So at the end of the chapter, Hans offers the idea of a post-imperial preference, giving priority to migrants from former colonies as a form of reparations. So there's been quite a lot of discussion about this, especially by Tendai Yashume, if I'm not butchering her name, who is the former UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms, or she was a rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, and she's now a law professor at UCLA. And so she's made this argument in kind of in quite an extensive way. So while I see there are really, interesting benefits to this, it nevertheless assumes a number of things. First of all, that colonialism only affected or affects those directly from colonized countries. Second, it relies on the idea that one would want to move to Europe or the metropole, and that this citizenship is the ultimate prize that is, And third, it assumes an individual model of reparations, migrant by migrant. So, she's saying, well, you should allow migrants to go to Europe as a form of reparations for what they did in Africa. But it is, it's an individual. There's a lot of things around it. It's a place to start, obviously. There are problems with each of these solutions. For instance, I think both in the UK and certainly France that I know, the geographies have been structured by colonialism, right? It's not just where one is from, but the actual spatial structuring of life, right? So whether one comes from a former colony or not, one still gets slotted into forms of urban racialized segregation. So I think it's not easy to say, okay, you came from Senegal, therefore you have the right? I think you do, but I think everybody does, frankly. So I don't think this addresses all the, the histories adequately, but it's a great starting point. Okay, so I'll end with two questions. One is in the spirit of understanding colonialism as a history that extends well beyond the relationships between the colonies and the metropole and between discrete nation states, I'm curious how this solution that we're just talking about thinking about Commonwealth relationships works to decolonize the Commonwealth itself outside of the UK. So, for instance, I'm a product of the Commonwealth, but I'm also a product of French colonialism, having grown up in Montreal. In Quebec, which institutes the same policies and kind of racist policies as France, in the name of universalism based on laïcité, so banning the hijab, the burqa, and policing the use of language in quite an extreme way. So how would diving deeper into the Commonwealth address its intersections and enduring relationships with other colonial histories? So it's not just again, how do we think of these in relation to one another? And second, I think in light of the book, what kind of political containers should we have? Not regions, not nations, no borders. What would you say about that? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I thought you were answering.
No. I've spoken too much already.
Well, thank you so much to Steph for inviting me to promise and about this very, very interesting book. And thank you for your comments, because I share part of what you already said. This is a very interesting book that I think could reconcile a number of students with European studies. It makes a number of issues and questions very accessible, and you make a very wide body of scholarship very clear. And so I really thank you for that. It's a very rich book. In Eurowhiteness, you draw on numerous works of history, philosophy, political theory, as well as on a number of opinion polls and qualitative survey and studies for the most contemporary periods in order to develop an argument that we already talked about it a lot, but basically aiming at dismantling the equivalence that is very often established between the European project and the European construction and cosmopolitanism, openness, progress in general, and a number of very positive quality. And this dismantling operation is what enables you to show how the European project is fundamentally this is a hard one for me. Civilizational, imperial, and liberal racial project, and that it's been the case for several centuries, updated by the construction of the European, what we call now the European Union. And after showing how the idea of Europe was constructed across centuries, you analyze the discursive and narrative work involved in constructing a cosmopolitan and open Europe, and even sometimes a fundamentally anti-racist Europe, at least in discourses, particularly after the Second World War, placing the memory of the Shoah at the heart of a significant part of this project and this discourse. And you analyze the transformations and challenges to this project in the light of several crises. Of course, the Euro crisis, what was called the migrant crisis, and also the Brexit, in a very stimulating last chapter. I have to say that it was probably my favorite chapter as well. Before proposing ways of bouncing back, if not for Europe as a whole, at least for the UK. And I mean, we already have a number of comments, and I have like questions on a number of these topics about fundamental notions at the heart of your work. First, I would like you to go back to the way you define and you view this notion of whiteness, which is very, I mean, it's in the title.
Yeah.
It's very central in your work. And we understand the dimension of, radical othering and construction of an other. And we also understand that it's a notion that's it's not something new, that it's a notion that's been constructed several centuries ago. And but very often in the book you talk about whiteness, but about othering in general, and not just racial othering, even though we see some connections. So I would like you to maybe go back to how you what is whiteness in your book in general, because one of the others that is being produced is the United States, in the way the European Union is, the European project is viewed, especially after the 1960s, and under the influence of countries like France. And so, I'm not sure that whiteness is really the central other here. So I'd like you to go about there, because constructing the US as another is not the same as constructing colonial subjects as others. Colonial subjects are not constructed as others the same way at the very beginning of the colonial, the colonial project, and at the beginning of the 20th century or the mid 20th century. So how do you articulate whiteness and the general process of othering is really what the first question I had when I was reading your book. Then I have two sets of questions that might be contradictory, but you mentioned the way, and it's actually very central, the way in which a pro-European perspective. So you talk about pro-Europeans a lot in the book, and how their pro-European perspective was built around notions of democracy, freedom, positive values, cosmopolitanism. And very often I wondered, reading, who are these pro-Europeans? Who are these pro-Europeans? We understand that we're talking mainly about, the elite of a number of countries who are making decisions for the countries and within European institutions. And so my first question is a very simple one. Is or was the general public and citizens of European countries fooled by these discourses? Because except in the last chapter, we don't really see what people made of these general discourses. You had a sort of elite top-down discourse around the positive dimension and values of Europe. But and so what would people make of this these courses? So in the last chapter, you more specifically on the question of Brexit, you go back to this sort of long-standing legitimacy deficit that exists in Europe. But I'm wondering about that lack of legitimacy throughout, because that isn't a new phenomenon either. And we can think about, the very low rates of participation and turnout during European elections in Europe. The fact that generally people are not that interested in European things, European issues, European affairs. I was even referring to the book as a good way to reconcile, with European studies. I remember being a student at Sciences Po, a place which trains a number of people who are going to work one way or another in connection with the European Union. And, the trend with which I would go to my European studies classes. And at the same time, and that's where there's maybe a contradiction between my two questions, but I felt like it was important to add both of them. I also remember being a student in February 2000, and it was a Monday, and having my law professor coming into the amphitheater, in a very gloomy mood, and everyone was very concerned and worried because Jörg Haider had just won the elections in Austria. And it appeared at the time, the far right had won an election in one of the in a European country, and a number of governments and people in European institutions were wondering what to make of that. Now it's kind of it's interesting to see how concerned people were at the time of having a far right political party in power. And there was this sort of general sense among these young, very educated students that this was a very serious moment and potentially a very dangerous moment. And so, thinking about these pro-Europeans, isn't it possible that, especially for people born after the very beginning of the European construction, there was this sincere, genuine belief in all of these values and a strong belief that maybe the European level and the European project is better than the national project and the nation state. We sort of believe that, and it's probably something that's been very different in the last decade, but a number of polls also show in several countries that being in favor of the European Union or having a positive take on the European Union went along with having sort of general openness on a number of social and political issues, and that it was being pro-Europe was also a proxy for a number of liberal views on a number of social questions. And so I'm also thinking about that, about this pro-Europeans. What can you tell us about the evolution of this position of being pro-Europe? And I was thinking about that, not just in terms of, elite, very privileged people endorsing the European idea, probably because of their privilege, which is clearly part of the issue, but also thinking about maybe one of the most popular European projects built by the European Union. And you mentioned it very rapidly, and it's very central in Europe, which is Erasmus and the Erasmus program, and the fact that it's a program it's an university exchange program that involved thousands of people over several decades. So I'm wondering what about the true belief in Europe as a truly open project? Then I had questions and comments about the issue of Europe as a colonial project. But I think that a number of the things have already been said, except that thinking about Europe and its geographic boundaries. So we developed that already. But I was just thinking about places like Martinique and Guadeloupe and French Guiana and the Réunion Island and all of these French territories that are, in South America and the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean, and that are
Europe.
Literally Europe, where they have the euro, etc. And I thought about them. I'm skipping my question on the colonial project, but I think about them in relation to your last chapter and about this post-imperial preference. These territories are French departments. So it's not just, those are weird post-colonial places that are not independent, but are still former colonies and with strong colonial legacies. But still, if we think about this post-imperial preference, I think that I share a number of the maybe that you had, because we do have examples of what that would mean, freedom of circulation, even though they are not technically in Schengen, but also we see what it makes, what it entails in their own geographic regions in terms of limitation of circulation of people in surrounding countries and places. I remember how people would protest about the fact that it would be easy for German and Greek to come to Martinique, but not to St. Lucian or Dominican, who lives like right there. You can see the cars in Martinique. So I was wondering about, maybe questioning a little bit this notion of post-imperial preference. And Steph, I don't have any time. Last, in the discussion, I have a question on community of memory. And thank you very much for this very stimulating.
Thank you.
Try and address your first preferences and people can call on you, right?
Yeah, perfect. So, first of all, thank you so much. That's such great comments. And I'll try to be very, very brief because there's just so much I could say in response to all the different points you've made. So maybe I'll just pick, two or three of them. I guess, first of all, because it's so central, Miriam, your point about, well, what is whiteness and what is Euro-whiteness? I guess I should... sure if I have a good answer, and it's not something that I theorize. Part of the reason that I chose this title, I wanted to have this title, because you're absolutely right that actually what I talk about in the book, and my opening remarks, I said some of this. What I actually discussed in a lot of depth is the history of the multiple others that Europe had, right? And as I said earlier on, that starts out before the concept of race, certainly whiteness even exists, right? It's about Muslims and Jews. And then, as you mentioned, sort of, in the 20th century, you have, the United States, but also Russia, being constructed as European others as well. And so how that fits in with the connection, which I think does exist between Europe and whiteness, is something that I need to think about some more. I don't have a good answer to that. But part of the reason that, as I say, I insisted on this title was precisely, though, that I think we need to talk more about the connection between Europe and whiteness. Which, to me, it seems, almost kind of obvious that there is a kind of historical conceptual connection there. And yet it's something we don't want to talk about, and particularly we don't want to talk about in the context of the European Union. And in a lot of discussions I've had about the book since it came out, and by the way, this is something actually I hear particularly in France, it's one thing to talk about the colonial origins of the EU, the relationship between Europe and colonialism, the history of Europe. That's all fine. But race, and in particular whiteness, is not it's an American concept, right? It doesn't transfer into Europe, right? And I feel quite strongly that it absolutely does. And it feels to me that where we are in, in terms of the scholarship we have, is we have now a really extensive body of scholarship on history of whiteness in the American context. It's nearly all in the American context, right? What we don't have is enough scholarship on how that concept functioned in the European context. And as I say, a lot of people, particularly in France, want to say, well, that's because it just wasn't an important category in the history of the French Empire. To which I would say, well, what about the Code Noir, right? I mean, the edict that governed slavery in the French colonies explicitly uses racialized, the language of color, right? So, I think that indicates that there's a gap in the knowledge that we have, rather than that it's not a concept that works in context. My book is, in a way, not even trying to fill that gap, but just trying to point to that gap in a way. I could say much more about that, but I think you totally pointed out something quite important that I need to think about some more. And then, yeah, maybe the second thing, maybe I'll just say something briefly about this concept of post-imperial preference and sort of migration and reparations. And I guess, all I really want to say is that, again, this is really just another issue that I was trying to put on the table in a particular context rather than propose a, worked out solution to. But to the extent that I even put it on the table, I was trying to, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of this. So in particular, I think the exact phrase I use is, you could imagine immigration policy, and this is, as you mentioned, both of you, in the British context, and I'm talking about this, you could imagine this as forming part of a project of reparation. But I'm not suggesting for a minute that it's the whole story. And this is one of the issues that, as you say, Tendai Achiume discusses in her paper on this, that how does this fit into a broader project of reparations? And there are all kinds of problems with it and so on. So I really don't want to suggest, really don't want to overstate how much of a solution this or anything. The context in which it emerged, just for those of you who haven't read it, is essentially this history, though, of British immigration policy since 1945, which is, by the way, quite personal for me because my father's Indian, my mother's Dutch. I talk about this a little bit in the book. So I have one parent who is from, an EU member state, European country, a founding EU member state. One parent from a non-European country that was the British colony. And when my parents both came to Britain in the 1960s, it was much easier for someone like my dad, someone from India, to come to Britain than someone from Holland, like my mum. Because that was this period in which immigration to Britain came from the Commonwealth, in particular Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent. What's happened in my lifetime, as Britain joined what was then the EEC, is that balance has shifted. It became increasingly hard for people from Britain's former colonies to come to Britain, and it became increasingly easy for people from Europe to come to Britain. And I think one of the questions that Brexit raises is whether this is an opportunity to kind of rethink that balance in our immigration policy. And actually what's happened, even with a Conservative government in Britain since 2016, is there has been a partial sort of reversal of that shift that's taken place in my lifetime. If you look now, Brexit didn't lead to a massive fall in immigration. It's led to an increase in immigration. It's led to a big fall in EU immigration and a massive increase in non-EU immigration, in particular from former British colonies, above all India and Nigeria. The numbers are quite staggering, actually. You feel it, by the way, in London at the moment. It feels like it's full of Indians, frankly. First generation immigrants, with accents, not second, third, fourth generation. And that already, I think, just challenges the idea that we have of Brexit, the story we've been told. In particular, I think in the United States, this assumption that I think a lot of people have that Brexit equals Trump. I'm trying to suggest it's actually a little bit different from that, and it's much more. That's just really the context in which this idea of rethinking British immigration policy, and perhaps going back to something of the earlier period where we felt as if there was a certain responsibility that Britain had towards its former colonies that should be reflected in immigration policy. The anti-racist slogan of the 1980s was, "We are here because you were there," right? And I think there's a compelling sort of moral historical logic to that that I think we need to sort of revisit post-Brexit.
Okay, so the way that I'm going to run this discussion, also because we have people on Zoom, is for people on Zoom, please type in your questions and I will read them at some opportune moment. For those of you here, I will ask that once you've asked a question, if somebody wishes to piggyback, please do raise two fingers up. But please assume that you have about a sentence, at most 2 sentences in the piggyback. It's not going to be like an ever expanding question as we go. Nancy, and please identify yourselves before speaking. That goes, I'll identify people.
Hi, I'm Nancy. I'm a historian of the Middle East and doctoral my PhD at Columbia. I want to actually dig a little bit deeper even on this question of what you mean by whiteness and what is gained and lost by centering whiteness in our understanding of empire, be it from the EU, from the US, the UK, elsewhere. In many ways, what your book is about is it's a history of the ethic of colorblindness, right? Like how it is that we got to a place where precisely when empire or colonialism was at its height, the denial of these dynamics as being part of European formation is also stronger than it ever has been. Part of what concerns me about the centering of whiteness in this story, though, is that let's take Palestine or Israel as an example, right? If you ask any Israeli today about, whether they see what even Israelis will admit is Jewish supremacy, as whiteness, they will vehemently say no, because more than 50% of Israel right now is of Mizrahi descent. And indeed, part of the settler colonial claim of Israelis over Palestinian land is to say, well, there is some extent to which Jews, especially Mizrahi Jews, are indigenous to the land, be that Palestine specifically or the Arab Muslim world generally, right? And so what we see is what Andrew Canessa referred to as claims to indigeneity, the anthropologist. But what I would say is what happens when it's actually claims to racialization, not claims to whiteness, that functionally enable empire to function, right? And, we see this as well. I mean, Erica Edwards has written about this in the American context, right? How sort of efforts to diversify the American military, to emphasize, the standing of Black men within the American military was used to justify imperial American violence in Asia abroad, especially during the Cold War, right? And so I guess my question is, if we're really to get ahead of the paradigm in the EU today, is it really a question of whiteness, or does that actually obscure the means via which land dispossession is occurring as we speak? Jewish claims to land over Arab ones in Palestine as an example, but I mean, this is also in Morocco, right? Indigenous dispossession happening while the Moroccan state is saying, like, we love our Jewish subjects, right? That there's something actually much more fraught going on, which is the claim to racialization itself has become complicit in the way that empire functions.
Do you want to take a few, or shall I?
I was going to let you take a second and then we can, then I have Fred Cooper right afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, Nancy, it's a great question. I'm not sure if I have a good answer, except to say that, I'm certainly not proposing that the concept of whiteness can explain, imperialism or even colonialism everywhere. So, in the talks that I've been doing on the book, in the last couple of weeks, I'm constantly getting asked about Israel-Palestine and where it fits into the story. I haven't quite had it asked in the way that you just asked it. But I guess my response would be to say, well, I'm not sure that whiteness is a helpful concept in the context of Israel-Palestine. It may or may not be. I need to think about that some more. But it does strike me as if, if the concept of whiteness, to use your term, should be centered in the history of any kind of colonialism, it's got to be European colonialism, it seems to me. There it seems to me that there's a stronger case. But, as I say, I don't theorize this in the book, and it's something I want to think more about is how do essentially race and empire in the European context fit together. I haven't got a worked out theory of that.
Right.
Thank you. I haven't had the benefit of reading the books. I'm just going on. In the summary, I'm very sympathetic with where you end up, and particularly in this critique of the European project as it is today. I'm not sure about how you got there.
Yeah.
And particularly the continuity thesis that seems fundamental.
Yeah.
To it. So, three dimensions of that seem to me problematic.
Yeah.
One, it seems that for a crucial moment in the timing of your story, the real other of Europe was the USSR, and the otherness was not race; it was communism. Secondly, about the civilizing mission. Would you distinguish the civilizing mission from notions of development and modernization? It seems to me that this is the relationship of these concepts is important. Because the nice thing about the civilizing mission was how vague it was and basically how unmeetable it was. Whereas development and modernization are measurable and they have concrete costs and they have to be thought about in a very different way from the vaguer form of the civilizing mission. And development and modernization are obviously asymmetrical concepts. They're all about hierarchy. But they're not about hierarchy of whiteness. And in fact, if you read 1950s modernization theory, a lot of it is about the repudiation of whiteness, of racism. Basically, they're saying Black people can be modern too. They've got to get their act together to do it, and we've got to be the ones who help them. But basically, it is to say there are other ways of making distinctions among people, and they have to be seen in a dynamic fashion. And it does legitimize the exclusion of people who refuse to make themselves modern. And that was very important in a lot of the politics of the 1950s. But I think it's a nuance of distinction that I think is quite important, and I think does complicate your continuity thesis. And the third point I'd make is about the place of Eurafrica in the argument, where you see it as a really everything. The colonial becomes colonial in another way, becomes colonial in yet another way. But I think Eurafrica is a lot more complicated than that. And one of the flaws of the Hansen and Janssen book is they didn't look at African sources or ask what are Africans thinking about it. Some of the biggest advocates of Eurafrica were African. And they saw this as a post-colonial entity that was not the same as the nation state as the only type of entity. And what I didn't hear in your summary, and maybe it's in the book, is just how high the level of uncertainty was during the late 40s and 1950s and into the 60s about colonialism and what could be defended. And your Africa project, however hierarchical it was, could not be defended as a colonial project. And in fact, its attraction was precisely the opposite, that it was giving Africans a place in the project. And I think this is the main reason why it failed was precisely because it could not be just the old extractive colonialism. Africans were in a position to make claims and make demands, and neither France nor Germany wanted to pay the costs of actually making good on that. So the relegating of African states to associate status rather than membership was ultimately a political decision to say, we know we can't continue to treat them in a colonial fashion. We can't treat them because they're not white in that way. We're going to have to deal with them with it. If we deal with them in a Euro-African context, it's going to have to be political, and we better just to write off the whole project and abandon responsibility along with the cost, which then gets you to Miriam's point about innocence as a disavowal of moral responsibility.
Great, thank you so much, Fred. Great questions. So, and again, I'd need a long time to answer them properly, but maybe very quickly. So, on your first point, the real other was the USSR, and it was communism, not race. I think it was both. When I look at the history of the Cold War in the 1950s, what's striking to me is precisely how the ideological and the civilizational merge, actually, right? If you think about someone like Adenauer, who I talk about briefly in the book, there is this sense that the Soviet Union is a civilizational threat as much as an ideological threat, right? And this is sort of I think has a sort of almost symbiotic relationship between the way that in the early phase of the European project they're imagining this as a Christian project, right? This is partly why I think Charlemagne becomes such a significant figure in the early phase of the European project is not just because after the loss of those colonies in Africa, the founding 6 member states, that maps quite neatly onto Charlemagne's empire. It's not just that. It's that it is imagined as being a kind of a revival of the Christian Europe that Charlemagne embodied. This is very clear. It's very clear, for example, in Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, the sort of key figure in the pan-European movement, who then becomes the inspiration for the post-war European project. But it's also, as I say, very clear in people like Adenauer, where they see, and this, by the way, is where the United States fits in as well, because they see, all these debates that you have in the 1920s, but then continue into the 1950s around the European spirit being threatened by these 2 materialist civilizations. On the one hand, the United States, on the other hand, the Soviet Union. But they're talking very explicitly about, Soviet atheism and things like that as being a threat to a Christian Europe. So I basically think it's both.
Russians weren't quite white.
Well, and that brings us then back to Audrey's question, and I guess maybe I'll add to what I said before, but to the extent that the way I think of whiteness is in perhaps a slightly more expansive way, where it's not just about skin color, right? So I would absolutely include. One of the points I make, I think it's actually in a footnote, this is part of the reason why I use the term ethnic cultural rather than ethnic, because it seems to me in the history of Europe and history of racism in Europe, it's really difficult, it seems to me, to pick apart, culture, ethnicity or race and religion. I find it very difficult to sort of see those as separate categories. And I think part of the problem we have is that we see racism so much through the prism of that relatively short period where it's about biological or scientific racism. But for the most of the history of Europe, it wasn't as much about culture as about race. And then what I think's happened since 1945 is something, it's a very complicated story there to be told. But I think you have all of these elements. You have race, you have, and by the way, who gets categorized as white shifts over time, right? This is where, the Jews fit into the story as well. They become white. I mean, there's work on this in the American context as well, right? So whiteness is a shifting category, but it's also a very complex one that includes, I think, race, culture, and religion all at the same time. That's how I would think of it, anyway. Okay, and then very quickly on very important nuance, Fred, on sort of civilizing mission versus development and modernization. I think there are, some people would argue that development and modernization theory and so on there is a certain kind of continuity with the civilizing mission. I take your point about the differences. But I think I might want to contest that actually, that somehow this represents a massive break with earlier more racialized ideas of civilizing mission. And then, on Eurafrica, you're absolutely right. Part of the reason I didn't mention the term Eurafrica in my opening remarks and why I talked about European integration in the early phase as a colonial project is because you're absolutely right that Eurafrica was this kind of complex thing. It was kind of projection screen for all different types of actors, some of whom, as you say, were African leaders, like Houphouët-Boigny and so on. On the one hand, you had figures like Kwame Nkrumah, who absolutely saw it as a neo-colonial project. And then you had some who saw it in the way that you described. So I think that's right, that Eurafrica has this kind of complexity. But if you just focus, as I do, on the thinking of the basically the founding fathers and the key figures on the European side in that period, I think to me it seems fairly clear. I am persuaded by P.O. Hansen and Stefan Jonsson that you have a certain kind of continuity between the 1920s and the 1950s. That it's there's a revival of the idea of Eurafrica in the 1950s, and there are different actors involved. And there are some differences, but it's not I think, a radical break with the 1920s idea of Eurafrica. And as I say, I think from the perspective of European policymakers, it's very clear that, when they're using language like, Africa is France's dowry, when they're talking about.
They're also repeating.
Sorry?
They withdrew that. They backed off that.
Well, okay, but,
They knew they shouldn't have said that.
right, but it's a revealing.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it seems to be quite revealing. And then I could go on, the language of Africa as Europe's plantation. I mean, it seems to me I'm fairly persuaded by the idea that at least, on the part of European policymakers from the 1920s to the 1950s, they did see this as a way to continue European colonialism, albeit in a slightly modified form.
I want to ask you a question, and then I have a good number of others. So, I'll see how to do this very briefly. There's something that I really like, and something that leaves me very unsure about the history of European that you give in the first chapter, of ideas of Europe that you give in the first chapter. And I want to say both what I think it enables and what feels trickier. By doing this longer history, you produce an argument about continuity, which feels like it's very close to the sort of Fortress Europe approach of much further to the right. Like, you're basically giving an account that the far right gives about Europe. You do it in a critical mode, but it is also done in the sense of from Charlemagne, from the barbarian invasion through Charlemagne, and on to the defense from the Mongols, and that kind of scenario. And that has a history that's a very post-war setup. So on the one hand, I was finding myself thinking, you don't really need any of this at some basic point. Whatever a concept meant 3 centuries ago, it doesn't really make any difference to the last 70 years in that, if it is redeployed or used differently. I think that on the one hand, it gives you the chance to say, here is how memory culture constructs the Holocaust as part of a long European story that then generates both the kind of civic and the civilizing mission kind of. But I do think that at the same time, I'm sort of echoing a little bit something that Audrey was saying before. There's a way in which you are enabling a kind of populist language that is all too happy, I think, to take up this kind of language as to what Europe should be. Do you see how I mean this? That in a way, there is no tool adequate enough once the history is a history of centuries. Whereby they can't say, of course, that's exactly what Europe should be. Why wouldn't the Hungarian government say precisely that's why we signed into this business, or Germany say yes, of course there are problems about the regionalism. What can we do? Everybody else has it too. Look at China, look at the US, look at, so then the logic becomes one whereby what would be an enabling distinction between the civic regionalism and a kind of civilizing mission scenario, as you put it, would become one that has no defense internally against the worst versions of itself. In fact, one that almost suggests that this is what it was always meant to be.
Wow.
Sorry, that's a little harsh, but
no.
I think if I'm a little unkind, it kind of puts things on the table more easily.
No, it's great. It's great. It's great. I mean, I think I need to think about it some more, but I guess that is what you're saying in effect that because I talked about this idea of the history of Europe as a closed system. In other words, that there is this story we tell about the history of Europe that begins in classical antiquity and then runs through the Renaissance. I mean Christendom, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. Centuries of conflict, culminating World War II and Holocaust, and then ultimately the European Union, right? This is sort of in a way that the story of Europe, that the history of Europe that the EU would like to tell. And it's this kind of very self-contained history. In particular, it writes out of the story the influences of Africa and the Middle East on, various moments in this history. And it leaves out the other kinds of interactions. In other words, the way that Europeans, the presence of Europeans in non-Europe. Is what you're saying that, although I'm critiquing that version of that sort of Europe as closed system kind of history, by critiquing it, I'm sort of reinforcing it because
You're
that's still the
replaying it,
story I
right.
sell. Yeah, no, that's right.
You're sort
That's
of
right.
replaying it in the.
Yeah,
in
no,
that scenario.
I can totally see that. So you're right that there is another book that could have been written, which would sort of be the corrective to that history of Europe as a closed system. By the way, though, I mean, I think that exists already in various. I mean, if you think about something like, I don't know, let's take the beginning of the story, classical antiquity. If you think about something like Martin Bernal, Black Athena, right? You know, and there's a million other books like that I think do, you know, tell that different version of European history. I guess I could have written a book that would have pieced all that together that would have been different.
So let me phrase the question very quickly, very differently. Is your sense like, well, if this is the history they tell about themselves, you know, sucks for you, European bureaucrats, if you can't come up with a better defense against the populist right? Or is the version that you're offering like this is the kind of internal taint that has to be somewhat figured out differently?
I mean, I think if I was, what I don't quite get about your question is, you know, I think I would see what you mean if the only story I told about the evolution of the history of ideas of Europe was about ethnic cultural ideas of Europe. But because I'm, you know, and I've been told by some people that I'm too positive about the EU, right? Because I'm pointing to this history of civic regionalism, right? Some critics of the EU would say, well, even in the period you're talking about in the 60s and 70s, actually, you know, the EU was much more problematic. It was much more civilizational than you accept, right? So I'm trying to point to, you know, that possibility of a Europe that is not defined purely in civic terms, but that is moving, that is inching towards a more civic understanding of its own identity, in which the ethnic cultural elements are getting weaker and the civic elements are getting stronger. Right. And I think there was a period when that was happening, and I'm trying to point to the way that got lost. And so, you know, here's an example of this, right? Is this phrase, the European way of life. You know, there is in the current European Commission, the Ursula von der Leyen Commission, a commissioner for promoting the European way of life, whose job is in part to keep migrants out, right? Which makes it very explicit that migration is not just a difficult policy problem to be managed, it's a threat to the European way of life, right? So it's a civilizational understanding of the European way of life, because obviously the threat to the European way of life from migration is really about migrants from the south, not about, say, you know, Ukrainian immigrants, right? But there was an earlier phase, that phase that I was talking about in the European project, where you had French socialists using the phrase European way of life. And what they meant by that was the social market economy and the welfare state and this depoliticized mode of governance, right? And the principle of solidarity that the social market economy and the welfare state were meant to represent, right? So it's precisely this kind of shift that I'm pointing to. Now, the next question you might ask, which has a long answer, which I won't give now, is how do you then reverse the current trajectory? But I'm at least trying to point to that possibility.
And Eliana Hadji-Savas.
I am Turkish Excel. I'm a Hauser Fellow at NYU Law School this year, and I'm a political theorist. So I just, your critique of Habermas at the beginning of the book reminded me of something that happened when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the EUI, and one of the kind of law professors there, very famous professor of international trade law, you know, was entertaining some guests at the EUI, and he said to them, "Look around you; it's such a cosmopolitan place."
Yes, yeah.
And you know, like, I'm from Turkey, so I thought, you know, like he must be referring to me because I'm as exotic as it gets at the EUI, you know, quote unquote. And I think that like that kind of, I mean, it's a very deep-seated European reflex, right? To kind of think of Europe as universal, as cosmopolitan. And I think that's something that you see in Habermas's sort of optimistic characterization, and he's not alone. But during that period that you characterize as, you know, the era of optimism of the EU as like the harbinger of cosmopolitanism, thereby exaggerating the universalism of this project and exaggerating its civic aspect. But what also strikes me as problematic in that kind of, in Habermas's and kind of related stories about European integration is an understatement of the market building aspect and the market orientation of the European integration project. And, you know, just how kind of fundamentally EU law is oriented towards market liberalization.
Yeah.
Especially in the kind of last few decades, since let's say since the 80s, and Chris Bickerton tells that story very well in his book. So I wanted to ask you how the story that you tell in the book interfaces with the story of market liberalization. And I'll just give, one example. It was widely noted during the Euro crisis how these kind of colonialist discourses popped up in intra-EU struggles over fiscal austerity and budgetary discipline and so on, with the industrious Northerners and the profligate and indolent Southerners and so on. All the, suggesting kind of how deeply, first of all, that discourse is rooted and how easily accessible those kind of colonialist discourses remain in Europe. But also, I thought maybe it poses a kind of, challenge to your account, and already some commentators alluded to this, that it's another instance in which the, colonialism comes apart from whiteness, right? Because, it was a colonialist discourse. I wouldn't say it was a racialized discourse that was leveled against, Greece, Spain, Ireland, the unfortunately named, PIGS acronym. So anyway, I just wondered some of your thoughts about how the market liberalization project fits.
Right.
And Eliana?
Hi, I'm Eliana Hadjisalas. I'm a Remarque Fellow. You're going to love it. So good luck for next year. But I'm a lecturer at Birkbeck University of London.
Oh, great.
I just wanted to touch briefly on sort of legacies of empire.
Yeah.
So my research deals with British detention policy and the empire and refugees. So I was quite interested in this book. But what you were saying with regards to the history of the Holocaust, I thought was really interesting, especially when, and I'm sure this is a case that you're probably aware of, the government's push to establish a UK Holocaust official memorial and research centre, and the pushback against that from Britain's leading Holocaust historians, who came out and said, actually, we don't think that this should necessarily be established, especially when there seems to be such an issue with the establishment of a memorial to slavery and Britain's sort of murky history of dealing with its imperial past. And I just thought that kind of captures somewhat what you're talking about here. And I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about, how do we sort of deal with this kind of cherry picking of the historical narrative? And especially when we're thinking about legacies of empire, and now, introducing the subject as you have with regards to Europe, complicates the sort of the legacies of empire even further. And I was just wondering if there's anything further you could add to that.
Right. So I think Hans, go ahead, and then I have two more names afterwards. So we're going to go a few minutes over. If you need to leave, please leave right now. Otherwise, please wait until like 2:06, 2:07, then we'll pause there. So go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, by the way, thank you for bringing up Habermas, because it reminds me actually of something I wanted to say in response to you, Audrey, was because you asked about genuine cosmopolitans, as it were, and I think Habermas, when Habermas is writing about a cosmopolitan Europe in the 1990s and the 2000s, I think it is still possible to believe at that point, as I think Habermas does, that, for example, removing borders within Europe is the precursor to a completely borderless world, right? I mean, I think he genuinely sort of believes this. I think this all looks very different now, and that's part of the story I'm trying to tell in the book. But I totally take your point that there was a certain kind of genuine kind of belief in the sort of cosmopolitan potential of the EU. I think that's right. And then on your market liberalism question, so that it's perfect because it allows me to give the answer I was about to give to Steph about how you sort of reverse the civilizational turn. Because a big part of my argument, what I just said about this shift in the way that the European way of life is understood, the story I basically try to tell in the book about what's driving that is the neoliberalization of the EU, right? So if you hollow out the social market economy and the welfare state, which I think is roughly the story, then I think you start to turn to culture to define what Europe is, as opposed to this kind of socioeconomic model. So it's absolutely central to the story I tell. It's what's driving it, I think, is the neoliberalization of the EU, and I think that's part of a broader story in terms of the way that I think the way I would put it is that neoliberalism produces culture wars, right? Because it shifts. It shifts democratic contestation away from economic questions, distributional questions, to questions around culture. And I think what you have in the EU is a sort of an extreme form of that, because of the way that even more than the rest of the world, what's happened during the sort of neoliberal period is that within the EU, economic policy has been taken out of the space of democratic contestation, and say that shifts your debates to cultural questions. And then Eliana, thank you. On legacies of empire and sort of the Holocaust versus memory of European colonialism. So it's really interesting. I haven't looked at this in a lot of detail, but my impression is it's precisely during the period that Britain is a member of the European Union, and above all during the Blair government, that Holocaust memory starts to become more entrenched in Britain in a way that it never previously had been. I think it's during the Blair government, for example, the 27th of January is made, Holocaust Memorial Day. So I think in a way that has been one of the consequences of British membership of the EU, is to remember the Holocaust more, because as I say, this is so central for how the EU thinks about itself. But then if I compare, say, Britain to Germany, which is the other country I know best in Europe, and I mentioned earlier on that I think part of the story here is about how West German memory culture is sort of uploaded to the European level. So there's this way in which Europe has to remember in the way that Germany remembers, right? And I think if you compare Britain and Germany, it feels to me as if Britain does have a much better balance in terms of remembering the Holocaust on the one hand and empire on the other hand, whereas Germany, I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary, I think, how central, obviously, the memory of the Holocaust is, but how, and how in 1952, you had the Luxembourg Agreement, which provided reparations to Israel and to the world Jewish community. And yet it's only literally in the last couple of years that Germans have begun to think at all about the first genocide of the 20th century that took place in German Southwest Africa, that's now Namibia, the Herero and Nama. Most Germans simply have never even heard of this still, right? And so we're beginning now to get a debate about how Germany should remember that. And the very beginning of a debate about reparations. And by the way, this brings us back to your point, Fred, because what's so striking about it is, even though, as I say, in the Luxembourg Agreement in 1952, Germany agreed to provide reparations. The way that this is currently being framed in the debate about Namibia is not in terms of reparations; it's in terms of development. Right. This is basically charity to Namibia rather than reparations.
I think I'm going to call for an end because we're already at 2:05. Any questions going to take a couple minutes, and then we're going to go on. Thank you so very much, Hansen. Thank you. And you may, of course, continue. For those of you that I didn't manage to call on, Hans is right here. He's not going anywhere.